Hey y'all, what's up? It's me, Mama King, the Divine Oracle. It's time for another reading of the Great Cosmic Mother. We're going to read the section called The American Split. It starts on page 330 to page 345, about 15 pages. Okay. All right, settle back and enjoy and follow along if you have a copy. Okay. The American Split. Americans are frequently told, especially with a resurgence of television evangelism and fundamentalist politicians, that America is a Judeo a Judeo-Christian nation founded on biblical principles. Such a statement easily passes by all those Americans who don't know much about our own history, and most of us don't. The English Puritans who first arrived to colonize America were highly biblical people. As Marx I. Diamond points out in The Indestructible Jews, these Puritans regarded themselves and were known in England as Heberists, Hebraists. Okay, they took the Old Testament as their model of government. And once in America, they modeled their new homeland upon Old Testament principles. Though nominally Christian and worshippers of Jesus in social and political effect, it was the Old Testament that served as the ideological matrix of the laws and customs the Puritans attempted to live by in the New World. So the Puritans were highly influenced by the Old Testament concepts of a people chosen by the biblical God to exert his will and especially to lead the rest of the world to righteousness. Diamond writes, it was the Roman Christians who, with sword in hand, converted the pagans of Europe, those bringing them their first knowledge of the Old Testament and its concept of manifest destiny. The spirit of the frontier was merged into a political manifest destiny by the Puritans, who transformed the Jewish concept of a religious manifest destiny into a political manifest destiny, believing it was God's will that Americans should rule the continent and the seas beyond. At the founding of Harvard University in 1636, the two main languages taught were Hebrew and Latin. Governor Cotton of colonial Massachusetts wanted to make the Mosaic Code the official state law and Hebrew the official state language. When women and some men were accused, brought to trial, and executed as witches in the colonies, it was by these Puritans who were thus interpreting Old Testament injunctions against Neolithic goddess religion as a colonial mandate to destroy New World witchcraft and paganism. For these Puritans, the New World was very much the biblical world of Yahweh, and when Americans began pushing at the western frontiers, clearing lands of forest and Native Americans, all the way to the Pacific, it was the Puritan Old Testament concept of a manifest destiny that fueled their drive to the West. As Diamond says, though the political power of the Puritans was broken in 1800, their ideology became the American ethos. This Puritan ethos worked its way into fundamentalist belief in Protestant capitalism in general. A profound conviction that the political establishment of America and later its political economic hegemony, Hegemony, I've never heard that, over the entire hemisphere. Okay, I get it. Perhaps someday of the entire world were manifestation of God's will, a divinely mandated national destiny. But Puritan religious power was broken in 1800. It was broken or blocked or rechanneled by the second major influence on American life, the secular power. Who and what was this secular power? The founding fathers, as they are called, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, et al. Et al. Et latum. Okay. At large. I don't know. The men who wrote the documents and espoused the ideas leading to the break with Britain and the American Revolution. The men who wrote the Constitution and Bill of Rights and in general established the legal, political, ideological matrix that became American government and American ideals of freedom and independence of thought and behavior. The founding fathers were not Christian. They were deitist. Deism was an 18th century rationalist philosophy emerging from the European Enlightenment. Deitists understood God to be the principle of organization and intelligence in the universe. This ordering principle could be discerned by rational thought and investigation, but it was not a personal deity who could be petitioned by humans. Deitists considered themselves to be decent and spiritually devoted men. But when they said God, they referred to cosmic law, not the God of the Judeo-Christian Bible. Some deitists, including the American deitists, spent a good amount of time and energy criticizing and refuting the superstitions, dogmas, and rituals of the organized Christian churches, both Catholic and Protestant. The major premises of Christian religions are 1, the idea of original sin, and 2, the belief in salvation through faith. Deitists totally oppose these two basic Christian principles. Instead, they espoused the 18th century philosophy that defined human beings as 1, essentially good, and 2, capable of progress through knowledge, reason, justice, and liberty. Deitists denied the dogmas of the virgin birth, the divinity of Christ, and concept of heaven and hell, and all ideas of damnation and redemption. Deism was in fact the origin of what is now called secular humanism, and it was a practicing philosophy of the men who conducted and won the American Revolution and became the founding fathers of the American government. The European Enlightenment, of which deism and the American Revolution were important elements, was a reaction against the historic collusion of court and church, which had made a bloody debacle of European history. The American deist, am I saying it? I'm putting too many syllables. The deists lived on the still raw edge of 5 centuries of Christian Inquisition and perpetual sectarian warfare in Europe. The historic ravages of persecution and scapegoating, the arrest, tortures, burnings, and daily terror, the confiscation of the property, as well as the life of anyone accused of heresy or witchcraft. These nightmare events were still quite alive in the minds of men like Paine, Jefferson, and Adams. The Inquisition and witch hunts were the recent history of their people. This is why they wrote the Constitution and Bill of Rights in precisely the way they did. The First Amendment was not a philosophical abstraction. It was an attempt by non-Christian men to structure a respect for religious belief. For religious freedom of belief or non-belief, along with a strong legal control over any church's ability to condition the minds of American citizens with the alliance of the government. The two prime virtues for deist. Hold on, let me see how to pronounce this.
Deist.
Now the UK says
Deist.
The US is
Deist.
Okay. I'm an American through and through. Deist. Now, where did I go? Where did I stop? The deist, okay? So this is why they wrote the Constitution and Bill of Rights in precisely the way they did. The First Amendment was not a philosophical abstraction. It was an attempt by non-Christian men to structure a respect for religious freedom or of belief or non-belief, along with a strong legal control over any church's ability to condition the minds of American citizens with the alliance of the government. The two prime virtues for deists were liberty and knowledge, for white males like themselves at least. Any church state amalgamation threatened liberty and knowledge, which they rightly saw as enclosed in a mutual feedback system. One needs the other for either to exist. The American deists were just one generation removed from a Europe reduced to spiritual and intellectual rubble by the power partnership of church and state. They wanted to prevent them from happening in America. They wanted the New World to have a chance to be new for white men like themselves, at least. Another strong non-biblical influence on the American Constitution came, of course, from the original inhabitants of this continent. The great law of peace of the Longhouse people, known as the Iroquois Confederation, or League of Six Nations, is perhaps 1,000 years old and still governs the Longhouse people of Northeast America. Its intent was to unify Indian nations or tribes who spoke different languages into one communicating body as an alliance for peace. The deistic founding fathers were aware of this great law and impressed by its sanity and practical wisdom. They incorporated much of its spirit and some of its organizational details into the U.S. Constitution. To this degree, the Constitution is a true and organic expression of the original American pagan spirit, deriving not from the Judeo-Christian Bible's pastoralist moralisms, nor yet strictly from European rationalism, but from the indigenous earth-oriented Indian consciousness of this land. When Thomas Jefferson said, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man," he was referring to his deist God, the God of liberty and reason, and the tyranny he referred to was religious tyranny. Jefferson expressed admiration for the principles of the gospel Jesus, but he did not believe these principles were exemplified by organized religion. On the contrary, difference of opinion is advantageous in religion. The several sects perform the office of a censor morum over each other. Is uniformity attainable? Millions of innocent men, women, and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burnt, tortured, fined, imprisoned, yet we have not advanced 1 inch toward uniformity. What has been the effect of coercion? To make one half the world fools and the other half hypocrites, to support a roguery and error over all the earth. Reason and persuasion are the only practicable instruments. To make way for these, free inquiry must be indulged. Ask for the biblical God. Ask for the biblical God. As for the biblical God. Jefferson described the Old Testament Yahweh as cruel, vindictive, capricious, and unjust. Thomas Paine spent a good part of his adult life fighting the Bible, its God, and its ideas. This is what he had to say about it. Whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and torturous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness with which more than half the Bible is filled, it would be more consistent that we called it the word of a demon than the word of God. It is a history of wickedness that has served to corrupt and brutalize mankind. And for my part, I sincerely detest it, as I detest everything that is cruel. Louis Michel, Michel, Louise Michel, one of the heroines, I was going to say it's French, one of the heroines, Louise, okay, Michel, one of the heroines of the French Commune who was exiled from France after the Commune's defeat, wrote in her memoirs, "Throughout the world, there are too many minds left uncultivated, between those who know nothing and those who have a great deal of false knowledge, those warped for thousands of generations by infallible knowledge that is not correct. The difference is less great than it appears at first glance. The same breath of science will pass over both." This was the spirit of the time, the spirit of post-Inquisition Europe, when freedom fighters saw clearly and spoke eloquently against the tyranny that had for so long been exercised, not simply over the human body, but over the knowledge seeking human mind and the freedom seeking human spirit by the collusive powers of church and state. People were seeking knowledge, liberty of inquiry, reason, science as the way out, the way over the hideous, tyrannous gray wall. Thomas Jefferson, the American deist, was writing in the same spirit when he deplored that religious slavery under which a people have been willing to remain, who have lavished their lives and fortunes for the establishment of their civil freedom. But as Jefferson, Madison, and the other deists saw, there were many people who were willing to risk their lives fighting for physical and political liberty, who then turned around and submitted their minds to religious dogma, to spiritual tyranny. Jefferson and Madison constructed the First Amendment to allow such people a freedom of religion to so do, but they intended the same amendment to absolutely prevent them or any church from imposing such mental and spiritual tyranny on anyone else. Because of their absolute insistence on a separation between state and church, because of their deistic beliefs in the innate goodness of human beings, and the evolutionary value of reason, knowledge, and liberty of inquiry in the development of a truly human consciousness, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, James Madison, George Washington, and all the other American founding fathers could be justly called the first American secular humanist, the same type that is now being called by fundamentalist preachers the enemies of America and those who want to destroy the American way. This strange reversal occurs because the fundamentalists identify the American way as the way of the Puritans, those pre-revolutionary English Hebrewists, who were indeed trying to live out the mandate of the Old Testament on American soil. But the Puritans did not conduct the revolution or write the Constitution that established the American government. This American way, the way of Paine, Jefferson, Madison, and the Bill of Rights, was the way of non-Christian deists, of men whose positive influences were not the Bible, but the European Enlightenment and the very secular works of Voltaire and Rousseau, the secular humanist way. In fact, which was not the invention of 20th century liberals, feminists, and other atheist pinkos, but was officially born with the birth of the American Constitution. As many of us were growing up, humanism was not a dirty word. It meant a generous concern for the liberty, well-being, and growth of the entire human community. It meant a rational acknowledgement of the fact that human beings build the human world, and if we build it greedily, fanatically, or stupidly, we will all end up suffering in it. During and after World War II, it meant everything opposed to Hitlerian fascism and Stalinist tyranny. In a naive but well-meant way, during those years, humanism meant the American way. For the past 2 decades, however, Christian fundamentalist preachers and ideologues have been trying quite loudly to redefine humanism as something un-American and even evil. Yeah. In their definition, secular humanism means putting humans at the center rather than God. And they insist this human-centered society is to blame for all the world's crime, violence, disorder, and general unhappiness. Socialists and many other people would argue that the modern Western world led by America is not humanist but capitalist, and that it at its functional center is not the human being but the dollar, and that it is not secular humanism but capitalist exploitation which is causing so much of the world's violence, degradation, and destruction. Further, when we look for examples of the societies that have put God at the center, what we see is appalling. We see 5 centuries of European Inquisition. We see the witch hunting obsessions of our own colonial Puritans, who were not above torturing small children until they testified against their own parents. We see Nazi Germany led by a crazed necrophiliac who proclaimed he was finishing the work of the Lord, a work of mass extermination. We see contemporary Iran ruled by the holy men who are executing 7-year-old children and lining their streets with the hung bodies of traitors against God. No human being, no preacher, no holy man, no church can put God at the center of life. God is already there. We choose to perceive or not to perceive this fact. No one can put God anywhere. God is already there. What the fundamentalist preachers and self-appointed holy men mean is that they are going to put some man's idea of God at the center, an idea that is born of the inflated egos of these preachers and holy men themselves. It is never to God, but to men's ideas of God and to the swollen egos of God's self-appointed policemen on earth that millions and millions of human beings have been torturously sacrificed in all the God-centered societies of the past 4,000 years of patriarchal earth. In all true religion, approximation to God is revealed by a steady growth of wisdom and peace. In false religion, approximation to some man's idea of God is always signaled by increasing fanaticism and bloodshed. The God so many contemporary fundamentalists of any religion want to put in the center of our lives is in fact a regime of total tyranny established by mortal men in the name of God, and in name only. So the first American secular humanists, the founding fathers, and in particular Paine, Jefferson, and Madison, saw this problem very clearly because they were children as well as students of European history. They were also children and students of American colonial history and had observed how quickly the old inquisitional mind had flared up in the New World and the habits of the Puritans. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights were their attempts to save America from becoming one more God-centered tyranny ruled by holy men with a terrible bloodlust. There was a third stream in North American life. It was never really on the historical surface of white American consciousness, as were colonial Puritanism and the rational humanist deism of the constitutional writers. It has always been an underground stream, that of wilderness, of sensual innocence, of paganism. Many Europeans did come to America with a conscious desire to escape civilization, a civilization of constant inequity, harsh morality, and warfare, and return to nature. America was an entire hemisphere of pure nature. Not a few European men, this stream was mostly male, did return to wilderness in America. They joined Indian tribes or became frontiermen, exploring ever westward until they hit the Pacific seawall. Some of these people were just blindly running from the straightened life. Others were consciously pagan. This underground stream emerges as a real American dream, a peculiar just for innocence which is always sought and never found. This pagan American search was never for the Puritans' moral God or the deist irrational God, but for the time of paradise before God. The garden of beasts, trees, and human souls living in harmony before Yahweh, Christ, and Socrates. There is a kind of generic memory that such a time did exist, and America briefly seemed a place where it could be refound. In 19th century America, there were many Edenic or utopian experiments in communal living, fueled by a dream of communal harmony and personal ecstasy. But the twin gods of morality and rationality always seemed to prevail, either breaking up such communes from within or barreling down from without to drive them out of town. The great American tradition of normality has always been a public device for controlling and exorcising these lurking demons and dreams of personal wildness. Behind every lynch mob, every cross burning, every racist attack on the dark other, as behind every social snobbery or polite rule of exclusionary etiquette is a rationalist Puritan terrorizing his or her own pagan heart. Normal people fear this wildness so much because it is always there, indigenous not only to this land, but to our own pre biblical roots. But our conscious returns to the pagan have been sporadic and local. Bohemian, beat, and hippie communities in America have attempted it. Such attempts have affected and changed our lives, stylistically and politically, perhaps more than we know, but never for long enough or inclusively enough. The paganistic return to nature is like the Buddhistic salvation from the world will. Nobody really does it until we all do it. North Americans, more than any other people on earth, have a hard time returning to our roots because for most of us, our roots are elsewhere, buried under hundreds and thousands of years of the man's history. We can never return to the Garden of Harmony and Ecstasy until we know how to pass through those two fierce angels, two of wands, blocking its entrance, moralism and rationality. And we can never get through those patriarchal door guards until we remember whose garden it really is. That's what I'm saying. So just as much of the rigid Puritanism of Protestant fundamentalism can be traced to the biblical Old Testament, so a good deal of Catholicism, historic misogyny and zeal to convert can be traced to the New Testament's St. Paul, who was himself a fanatic convert and a fanatic misogynist. Throughout European history, there were periodic attempts by people who saw themselves as Christian radicals to break the grip of the Old Testament and St. Paul on the established churches and over the Christian mind. These people chose to follow the gospel image of Jesus as a radical social reformer, Jesus as social revolutionary. The Templars, the Beghards, the Beguins, Beguins, the Albigensians, and Catharenes, or so forth, all tried to practice what they understood as gospel communism, a naked and ecstatic sharing of food, goods, and mutual care. Some of these medieval Christian communes tried to practice sexual equality. Some extended their communal practices to the sharing of their bodies. Others maintained a strict marriage fidelity or practiced celibacy for Gnostic visionary purposes. All were accused by the Church of social and spiritual heresy, including orgiastic sexual behavior. They all ended up at the stake. Many of the experimental communes on 19th century North America were composed of similar radical Christians trying to live out their interpretation of the Gospels and of the Jesus image as a call to return to communal living and ecstatic, non-possessive behavior. Within a Victorian society that valued the accumulation of private property and wealth as a moral duty, the North American communalist practice a sharing of shelter and all material goods and daily activities within a Victorian society that covered piano limbs with crocheted cuffs, so it was not forced to see or even say the fact of legs in a society that had more brothels per capita than any other society on earth. So the radical communalist practiced either free sex or strict celibacy, with marriage partners living as brothers and sisters. These communal experiments in North America, like the hippie communes of the 1960s, were marginal and elitist middle class by necessity. There was no way for them to reach or affect the lives of large numbers of people or to radically change the values and structure of the larger society. All these communal or utopian experiments of Europe and North America, Christian or otherwise, saw what they considered to be social greed and injustice and sexual hypocrisy and repression practiced in the name of God and Christ, and they counteracted with radical experimentation, i.e. radical going to the root. Within a Christian capitalist context, radical social experimentation always means 1. Communal living and sharing of goods, 2. Sexual freedom and equality, 3. Practice of visionary and ecstatic techniques, both communal and individual. Many of these communalists have called themselves the true Christians or consider their experimentations to be closer to Christ's gospel intentions than the normal lifestyles approved by the church. But in fact, such social revolutionary communal experiments are always a reversion to pre Christian pagan social and spiritual structures, even though they sing and dance to gospel texts. Within a Christian capitalist context, a radical Christian behavior is always a reemergence of paganism. And this is why it is always opposed and crushed by the church, regardless of what the Gospels may say about the lilies of the field and spiritual poverty and the virtues of not possessing wealth or worldly power. The Christian church, both Catholic and Protestant, has grown with and firmly established itself upon the practice of private property, and its existence is functionally embedded in a hierarchic framework of social classes based on wealth. The wealthy and powerful uphold the church as a major instrument of social discipline and repression, and as the most effective inculcator of the divinity of the status quo. The church, in its turn, puts God's seal of approval on the existing social system, conditioning people from a very early age to see nonconformity as bad and serious rebellion as demonic. The Christian churches and the Western capitalist ruling elites have always worked together as a machine in Foucault's sense that perpetuates and rationalizes the advantage of the few while maintaining the many in a condition of productive repression via ideological control and channeling of their sexual spiritual energies. Liberation theology began in Latin America, where these classic conditions, the wealthy or ruling elite supported by the conservative Catholic hierarchy, dominating masses of poor people. In 1956, progressive church leaders found CELAM, the CELAM is a Latin American Bishops' Council, to discuss and counter these conditions with new ideas. And then came Pope John the 23rd and his Vatican Council II, which proclaimed the Catholic Church's option for the poor. CELAM met in conference by Medellin, Colombia in 1968 to find ways and means of putting Vatican II into practice in Latin America. One of the structural ideas emerging from the Medellin conference was the church-based community, where poor people gather in self-managed parishes to discuss religion and help each other with survival problems. In Brazil, particularly with its large population and great shortage of priests, these base communities spread rapidly. In 1984, there were about 150,000 church-based communities in that country, all actively supported by the Brazilian bishops. Brazilian Franciscan and theologian Leonardo Boff, one of the architects of liberation theology, has explained that the Brazilian Catholic Church needs these communities to help it face rapidly growing competition from numerous Oriental and Afro-Brazilian religions, and also from fundamentalist Protestant and Mormon churches that have been sent to Latin America from the U.S. with President Reagan's tactics support. Boff has defended the Catholic-based communities as the most creative way to compete with this pastoral challenge. They are the locus where the people meet together to read the Word of God, celebrate, and put into practice love of neighbor. This is the Church of the Poor in South and Central America. These base communities have spread everywhere among millions of people who are traditionally very spiritual and also struggling to survive oppressive conditions as well as overthrow U.S.-backed political military dictatorships. And Christians in the Nicaraguan Revolution, Margaret Randall, has shown the strongly inspirational and tactical effect of the Christian based communities and liberation theology on the people of Nicaragua, who were able to harmonize their religious vision with successful armed struggle against the dictator Somoza and his U.S. trained National Guard. This is the inspiration of liberation theology among the people and the threat it poses to the ruling elites. When poor people read the Bible, they interpret Jesus as a social revolutionary, and liberation theologists have interwoven these popular radical interpretations with traditional theology. Boff, in particular, has applied Marxist economic analysis to the hierarchic, conservative, imperialist, social, and religious structures dominating Latin America. In Church, Charisma, and Power, 1981, he analyzes the Catholic Church from a Marxist perspective as a capitalist institution. For this and his whole range of politically provocative and inspirational thoughts, Boff was called to Germany in September 1984 at the Pope's request to be questioned by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the Archbishop of Munich. Ratzinger was put in charge of the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1981 for the express purpose of questioning and discipling liberation theology. This congregation is what remains in the modern world of the old European Inquisition's infrastructure. The Vatican and conservative Catholic churchmen in Europe and Latin America have, since early 1970s, joined together to target and denounce Christians for socialism and liberation theology in general, as well as Marxist infiltration in CELAM. They claim that any use of Marxist economic structural analysis threatens to expand into an atheist Marxist undermining of the human spirit, or at least the church's control over the human spirit. In fact, the church has always seen any analysis of the human condition beyond its own as a threat to its imperialistic hegemony. Hegemony? That's got to be it. Hold on.
Hegemony.
Oh, I was all off. Hegemony, that's U.S. pronunciation.
Hegemony.
Hegemony, and that's UK. Okay, hegemony. I should mark my place when I start looking for these words. So, the Vatican and conservative Catholic churchmen in Europe and Latin America have, since the early 1970s, joined together to target and denounce Christians for socialism and liberation theology in general, as well as Marxist infiltration in CELAM. They claim that any use of Marxist economic structural analysis threatens to expand them into an atheist Marxist undermining of the human spirit, or at least the church's control of or over the human spirit. In fact, the church has always seen any analysis of the human condition beyond its own as a threat to its imperialist hegemony. It created the Inquisition in 1200 to fight heresy, i.e., the Arabic worldview. Later, in 1484, it launched its 300-year-long war on witchcraft, i.e., the pagan European worldview. And now, in the mid-1980s, and this is when this book was published, okay? In the mid-1980s, it fights Marxist atheism. In all cases, the church claims to own the true spirit. It pretends biblical textual support for its authority, and it denounces its opponents as heretical and ungodly. But Marxism didn't exist during the Inquisition, nor is it essentially Marxism the church is fighting. It is in fact engaged in the same centuries-old secular power struggle against rival social visions as well as rival religions. When it denounces Marxist analysis and the communalist visions of socialist Christians, it is truly fighting its old war against the radical Christian vision of Jesus as social revolutionary, a vision that is always, at its ontological core, a reversion to pre-Christian paganism. Because the Bible is not the word of God, but the words of men, of many men, and of many times, its Text can be used, like Bartlett's quotations, to support just about any argument one is espousing. In Deuteronomy 5:17, Yahweh says, "Thou shalt not kill." In Deuteronomy 2:34 and 7:1-2, in Leviticus 21-27, and throughout the books of Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Samuel, Kings, Yahweh commands that his people kill a long, explicit list of people Yahweh finds offensive. Human sacrifice to idols is divinely condemned. Yet on page after page, Hebrew heroes like Samuel chasing their enemies by annihilating whole villages, butchering pregnant women, infants, and old people, right down to the cows and ducks and geese. And these melee type massacres are, we are told, not only condoned by God, but empowered and blessed by him. Which word of God do we listen to in the crazy bowels of the night? By the same token, there is as much biblical textual support for the idea of Jesus as a social revolutionary in the Gospels as a revolutionary's handbook, as there is for the maintenance of hierarch social systems based on wealth and ruled over by a political, religious, military dictatorship in God's name. In Margaret Randall's book at Nicaraguan named David Speaks. A Nicaraguan named David Speaks. Okay, there cannot be a church of the rich. Christ was the first to accuse the rich, telling them that it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. One does not need Marxist training or Marxist analysis to see the gospel Jesus as a spiritual and social radical breaking with the traditional hierarchy of his people and of imperialist Rome, denouncing both the wealthy Jewish and Roman ruling classes and their corrupt priesthoods, to call the human soul to rebellion against its condition, its false ontological condition, falsely rooted in an anti-spiritual, anti-holistic social order. The Bible, like all large cosmological works of the human mind, gives to us essentially what we came looking for. The authoritarian looks for passages promising God's blessings on a fascist. No. How to pronounce fascistic? Fascistic? I don't know. They don't know either. Fascistic? Why I didn't pull it up? Yeah, that's what I want. Fascistic, the fascists. Okay. Oh boy. The authoritarian looks for passages promising God's blessing on a fascist status quo and finds them. The radical seeks confirmation of an active revolutionary vision and finds it. Certainly there are more than enough New Testament passages illustrating Jesus' radical social intuition and his desire to do away with the hardened and corrupt institutions that block and deform the aspirations of the soul, to give textual authority to the liberation theologists and their work. And when it comes to textual authority, we have to remember that the entire establishment, structure, and worldly power of the Roman Catholic Church was based on one joking pun made by Jesus, who said he would build his church on this rock, i.e. on the Apostle Peter, whose Latin name comes from Petra, meaning a stone. And thus Peter is legendarily the first bishop of Rome, and all the mythic and worldly authority of the Vatican derives from this pun. Politics happens when people realize that their daily survival problems are not caused by individual sin and guilt, but by a collective malfunctioning. Within patriarchal Christian capitalism, this is the taboo vision, whether it comes from Albigenism or Catholic heretics or pagan witches, or from 20th century Christian socialists as atheist Marxist. The vision is the same insofar as it is a collective, systemic, revolutionary approach to problems rather than a personal, confessional, therapeutic one. While liberation theology and the Church of the Poor activate the first, the political approach the Church encourages, as it has always historically enforced by law when it could, the latter, personal solution, a solution which, needless to say, keeps it in business. The conservative Catholic and official Vatican view is expressed by the German Bishop Franz Hinsbach, who since 1973 has been working through Bogota, Colombia, with conservative Latin American clerics to stamp out the influence of liberation theology and the Church of the Poor. Hinsbach insists that Christian liberation must be solely personal, a liberation from original sin and personal guilt, not from social structures. While liberation theology seeks to free human beings from decadent and exploitive social economic conditions, the conservative Catholic hierarchy apparently believes that hunger and poverty, forced and unrewarding labor, and massive brutal exploitation by global economic and political forces are to be understood and accepted by humble sinners as God's punishment for their sins. Or at any rate, such conditions are to be patiently endured without revolt, while individual souls concentrate on confessing their personal sins on their knees, never seeking justice or mercy or fulfillment on earth, but meekly believing such luxuries will come to them in heaven. Original sin, it seems, is the sin of being born poor, or if not, why not? Why don't the rich, the owners, the exploiters, the bosses, the ruling political, religious, and military elites have to suffer in this way? Bishop Hinsbach announced in 1977 the so-called libertarian theology leads to nothing. Its consequence is communism. Hinsbach, whatever his name is, his opinion was important on the secular, if not the divine level. The poor Latin American Catholic churches depend on funding from the very rich West German churches, and Hinsbach was at the time the president of the German Bishops' Conference, and thus in charge of all the funding for developmental and pastoral work in poor countries, specifically Latin America. Just before making his pronouncement on liberation theology, Hinsbach had been decorated with the Order of the Condor of the Andes by President Banzer, the dictator of Bolivia. Hinsbach's view of liberation theology is similar to the Chilean dictator Pinochet's view of democracy, which he called the breeding ground of communism. Another major Catholic warrior against liberation theology is the Belgian Jesuit Roger Wekemans, who has denounced it along with the Church of the Poor as a contagious virus. In the mid-1970s, Wekemans had been reported by the Washington Star and the National Catholic Register to have received, on his own admission, millions of dollars in funding from the American CIA and from the Agency for International Development, AID, and he had also boasted of advising then CIA Director John McCone to let one or two Latin American countries go communist so that it would then be easy to arouse anti-communist paranoia in the rest of the Western Hemisphere. So the Catholic Church, as the self-defined owner of the true spirit, denounces Marxist analysis as materialistic and finds liberation theology's emphasis on social economic problems with social economic solutions also abhorrent in its materialism. Apparently, the desire of the world's poor to eat, to feed their children, to clothe and shelter themselves and their children, to live creative lives, to spend their days in meaningful labor rather than numbing drudgery, to earn a fair reward for their work and a future for their children. Apparently, all this is to be seen as materialism. It can be seen so by the Catholic hierarchy only within the Christian dualistic system that separates flesh from spirit, and then pretends that the lifelong degradation of one leads to the eternal liberation of the other. In fact, suffering can and does enlarge the human consciousness, but not within a dualistic or anti-holistic system. Within Christian civilization, the suffering of the poor, generation after generation, has served as little more than nervous titillation for the well-off. The rich derive a complacent sense of continuous self-justification by muttering, "The poor we have always with us," etc., etc., and other selected phrases. Coming from the Vatican and the Catholic bishops of the wealthy German church, we have all spent most of their lives, who have all spent most of their lives in a heady atmosphere of pearls and gold and velvet and good wine. Such a charge of materialism is stunning. If we wonder if any of these princes of the church have spent much time sweating, starving, or shaking with cold, the answer is probably not. Nor is it spirit that clothes their daily lives in perpetual luxury. Rather, they are liberally endowed with the accumulated material wealth of centuries. It isn't the poor people who need redemption, but the fabulously wealthy churches themselves. The only way the Christian institution can redeem itself surely is by helping the poor and the persecuted realize equity and justice. Half the world's Roman Catholics live in Latin America. That is a powerful force. Enormous changes could occur if the Catholic Church, led by the Vatican, removed its holy sanctions from the exploitive systems of the rich and denounced and renounced the ruling political business and military elites it has helped bring to power and maintain in power for over 450 years throughout Latin America. But papal lip service won't make change happen. Total structural and ideological change is necessary. Libertarian theology and the Church of the Poor are such real attempts at change, and they are being called up to defend themselves before the grim persecutory shadow of the Inquisition. Can Christianity truly be revolutionary? Can it change its institutional ideological self and thus help change the world? What is Christianity? Insofar as it derives from both biblical testaments, it is a set of ontological principles or assumptions that must be confronted on an ontological level by anyone seeking a merger of the Christian religion and genuine world change. These principles are: one, that the Creator is separate from the creation, therefore does not participate continuously in evolutionary process. Two, that the Creator is pure spirit, mechanically dichotomized from a creation of impure matter. Three, that human beings have committed a primal sin or crime of disobedience to the will of God. Four, that God has therefore condemned the entire human race to continuous suffering and punishment on an evil earth is expiation for this original crime of sin our parents in Eden committed, right? Number 5, that to be born, therefore, is to be born in sin, i.e. to be born through the mother who represents the original sin and inherent evil of flesh. That to survive in the world of sin, the male must dominate nature, while women, as embodiment of that nature in its vessel, must undergo domination. Number 7, that the only way to be saved from this situation, from life on earth and the life after death, both defined as hells ruled by the devil, is through submission to Jesus Christ, who is defined by his religion as the only time in the history of the universe that spirit ever entered into matter, i.e. incarnated. That number 8, that these principles exist because the world is a mechanically structured dualism of God and devil, pure good versus pure evil, eternally at war with each other and eternally irreconcilable, in which human life is meaningful only insofar as it functions as a battlefield for these two forces. Human beings must choose one side or the other, but can never transcend the dualism or resolve them in holistic consciousness, which was the consciousness forbidden by Yahweh in the Genesis garden. Since the ontological worldview embedded in these principles is seen by many of us as the cause of the problem, how can radical change occur via these same principles? Can the world or Christian civilization be radically changed without radically changing the world's structuring ontology? How can one find a truly revolutionary solution without radically changing the terms and cosmological assumptions of the problem? Mary Daly is one of the few people among feminist or contemporary thinkers in general who has wrestled with this situation at its ontological roots. She has done so as a feminist in her books Beyond God the Father, Gen Ecology, and Pure Lust. In Pure Lust, in a section entitled The Courage to Sin, she points out that sin derives from a Latin word meaning to be. To sin is to be. Sin comes from the Old English syn, S-Y-N-N, meaning to sin, with the root word being Old English, es, to be, es, the root of being, as a basic Indo-European word root. Interestingly enough, in Hebrew, the word sin means the moon. To sin within the patriarchal religious context of Christianity is to risk being, i.e., within that context. True being can only occur in the renegade spaces outside the established religion, utterly outside and beyond its terms. The Christian dream has already been written from beginning to end. It says that only one life was worth living, and it's already been lived, and it was his. That's what it says. That's what it says. Ain't that what it says? Yeah, that's what it says. The best believers can hope for this in an imitation of Christ. Christianity promises to save the human soul, but in fact, Christianity exists by saving humans from the experience of our own souls. If we will forfeit our own mystical journeys through the world, if we will give up the dangerous adventure of discovering and creating our own consciousness and evolution, Christianity will give us in return a script about Jesus. And this is the only choice Christian ontology offers. One can spend one's life risking the sin of being, or one can submit and spend one's life following a dead script. The tragedy of Christianity is that it has kept untold millions of human beings from sinning, i.e., knowing from their own souls. That's it. That's the ultimate sin. Denying the Holy Spirit, denying your holy soul, denying your own wisdom. For it is life that Christianity promises salvation from. From your life? That's why you're here. From life directly experienced for the first time without the stale safeguards and blinders of a prefabricated script. Upon the machinery of sin and salvation, the whole Christian ontology rests. The figure of Christ that the church is based on is this machinery, i.e., Christ depends on human sin for its existence. One can say that sin is the food of the Christian church, and it cannot keep eating it if it does not keep producing it. Producing a definitive vision of life as sin, as experiential being we must be saved from. If the world has been held under 2,000 years of Christianity, it can be said to have been so as a result of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Christian machine is not programmed for any other result. In Nicaragua, in any place touched by the energy of liberation theology, the popular belief is entre Cristiana Somo y Revolución. No hay contradicción. Between true Christianity and people's revolution, there is no contradiction. That's what it said in English. But what is Christianity without the established Christian church, built on traditional biblical Christian ontology? Che Guevara said, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say to you that the true revolutionary is guided by great feelings of love. This is the radical Christian vision also, the vision of Jesus as a social revolutionary. Such a vision has historical precedent, going back through European Gnostic and heretical communalism, back through the gospel days, about 2,000 years older than Marxist analysis. But as we've said, it goes back even further than that. to the Neolithic vision of the vegetarian deity, or to the original Great Mother herself, primal beings who sacrifice themselves through love to restore and refructify all life on earth. The radical Christian vision is and always was a reemergence of paganism. To be truly revolutionary, Christianity would have to dissolve itself. It would have to dissolve its male-dominated and celibate hierarchies and the social class systems from which it derives its worldly power. It would have to renounce and dissolve totally the world hatred, the flesh hatred, the ontological misogyny, which has so long provided it with fanatic energy. It would have to renounce most of the Old Testament, most of the New Testament, and all of Revelation, which dooms us to a grotesque apocalypse. It would have to throw out Genesis to return us radically to an image of God based on the pre-biblical universal preception of a great mother, a bisexual being, both female and male in spirit and function, who wants us to enjoy ecstasy and to eat of the fruit of immortality. It must totally renounce and dissolve spiritual chauvinism, spiritual hypocrisy, spiritual paranoia, and spiritual tyranny, and all world systems built in the secular image of these spiritual distortions. It would have to wholly renounce and dissolve all perceptions, systems, and functions deriving from the false historical idea that some people have a divine mandate to co-opt, convert, genocidally destroy, or otherwise imperialize others. It would have to crucify itself in its own terms as expiation of all its guilt. But as we said, if the Christian church ever changed itself this radically, it would become pagan. To realize its most radical vision, Christianity can only reinvent paganism. So why not just simply be there? In North America, the rationalism of the founding fathers, the deistic or rationalism of the Enlightenment, which wrote the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, has given us a large measure of spiritual freedom, a freedom to experiment, a freedom from cradle to grave conditioning and control by the dogmas of any particular church in collusion with the state. We all owe more to this rational freedom than we realize because it has worked. We take it for granted. We have no concept of what it is like to grow up under the conditions of state-enforced religious tyranny. At the same time, this very rationalism has pervaded the American atmosphere with non-ecstasy. For generations, many people have felt they stood in a very dry, pragmatic wasteland, secular America, with no genuine tradition of spiritual celebration or communal epiphany. Americans long for this more than they know. The Earthsat's results are orgies of patriotism and game fever at parades and football stadiums. That's where we get our ecstasy. That's where we get our excitement or sexual energy from. But never quite the real thing, at least not as a communal experience. In Latin America, the Catholic Church, which is chronologically and psychologically much closer to the pagan than is anything Protestant, has allowed celebrations and customs of indigenous Indian people to remain alive, interwoven in a festive ribbon with Catholic holidays, Saints' Day, frequent loud celebrations of cycles and epiphanies. Latin America has this which North America longs for in the secret places of what's left of its soul. That's deep. But Latin America also bears a terrible burden of political and military dictatorships, partly at least established and maintained in power by almost 500 years of domination and status quo rationalization by one church. The death squads, the armies of terror and torture now running rampant through so many of this hemisphere's nations are in fact the leftover machinery of the Inquisition, never wholly dismantled in the Catholic tradition, and now re-oiled, updated, redesigned, and modernized by the imperialist interest of the new Roman Empire, which is corporate America. The American split in raw terms is this: nominal freedom without real life ecstasy, or nominal epiphany without real life freedom. Such a split is always the result when life is fed into the patriarchal dualistic grinding machine. which churns out globs of white fat or pours runnels of blood, which turns out tasteless hamburger, or the red screams of the butchered, which grinds out always one disconnected fragment or another, but never the whole feast, never holism, never the living, gratified flesh of a true spiritual vision. All right, hope y'all enjoy. Thank you for liking, subscribing, hitting the notification bell. I'll see y'all later. Bye-bye.